Each episode unpacks the challenges and opportunities facing today's leaders, from classrooms to boardrooms, offering insights that inspire real change. By redefining success, we're changing lives, empowering people everywhere to create environments where everyone feels a sense of belonging, whether at home, work, or school. So hey, sit back, relax, grab your favorite beverage, and join us as we explore the issues shaping our futures, one meaningful conversation at a time. Let's go!
Hello, and welcome to Do Good Work Podcast. It's your co-host, Terrell, joined live in the studio with my co-host,
Jaquan Johnson.
Listen, we have got a dynamic show for you tonight. And so hopefully all of you who are tuning in from across all of our various platforms are excited and looking forward to it. We have got Jamal Watson in the house, and he will join us on the stage in just a moment. But before we do that, y'all know how we do. We got to get other folks to know that the live podcast is on. And so make sure that you go and like and share. We are coming to you live on Facebook. We're on YouTube and X. And we certainly will be sharing the link on YouTube. So not YouTube, I'm sorry, LinkedIn. So if you have not already, please, we're asking you to join us in sharing the link for tonight's show. I see it already. So excited about it. And so like and share. And I'm going to make sure that we're on LinkedIn. But without further ado, we're going to bring to the platform our good friend and our brother, Jamal Watson. And so welcome, Dr. Watson, to the show. So glad to have you. So question, where are you tuning in from? Where are you coming to us from? Hold on a second. Let me make sure I can hear you. Hold on. Of course, y'all know we did this before the show went live and everything was fine. Of course, now that we're live, it wouldn't be our show if something didn't happen. Okay, try again. No. Are you muted? There you go. Now we hear you. Oh, no, that's us that I can hear.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know what happened. But it's great to be here.
Glad to be here. Okay, so we were asking, where are you in the world?
Yeah, so I'm in Tampa, Florida tonight. So
Nice.
I spent my time between DC and Tampa. So I'm in Florida today.
Okay, and what's the weather like there?
I think it's like 88 or 89 degrees, something of that sort. Yeah, it's pretty hot.
Yeah, we're coming to you live from Memphis, Tennessee. It's about the same here. Yeah, pretty warm, sunny.
Excellent.
All right, Jaquan, kick us off.
All right, you know how we start the show using the first letter of your last name. Describe your day or week. Dr. Watson, we'll let you go first. W.
Wild.
Wow. Why that?
Just a lot going on in the world, right? So so much to process, and trying to kind of keep attuned with what's happening in the world, and also keep one's sanity. In some ways, that's how I would best describe this week. It's been wild.
Yeah, that's for sure. I agree with that. I will go with Johnson J. So we did a podcast earlier today, so I'm making sure that I'm trying to make sure I don't say the
Different
same thing.
word.
Yeah, I would go with jolly. This today has been busy, but it's also been really good. We had a lot of work done. We got some time to do podcasts, meet some folks that we haven't seen in a while. And also get some writing done eventually, and some other work. So I would say, and I'm in Memphis, Tennessee, with my good friend, so I can't beat that. I would say jolly for me.
Can't complain. Listen, I would say, to use a different word, I'm pretty stoked. I don't know if I use that word. It's not in my vocabulary much, but I am, because I was just saying this earlier today when we were pre-recording the show, but we are on the show tonight with Jamal Watson. And, to have a podcast that, one, Jamal Watson would want to be a part of, and that we get to, we have a whole dynamic conversation set up for y'all. So, there's a reason why, but we were just saying a couple months ago, and you'll remember this, Jamal. We went to NASPA, and we went to NASPA to speak once about belonging, and the number of wonderful colleagues who just stopped us in the hallway on the escalator and was like, "Hey guys, I love what y'all are doing with the podcast. I watch it. I show it in my class. I do whatever." It was like a moment. It's just saying, like, "Josh, this is cool." To take it. To realize that your work is somehow reaching people. And so I'm stoked that the podcast is continuing to grow. Of course, we got to, we were saying today, we got to invest in ourselves, because, every single show we got something goes a little off, some technology glitch. And so we're going to up the ante.
Yeah, we got to invest in ourselves. Listen, although that there are some technical difficulties at times, we still make it through.
We've learned a lot.
We also know that, in the time where things are wild, many people have lost their jobs, especially from the pandemic to some of the work around DEI, and people have been laid off because of that. We recently started a new segment around a job corner, giving folks advice about, how to land a job. So, with your work in mind, as a journalist and also as a professor, what advice would you give someone that wants to pursue what you do?
So I think there's many innovative ways to think about how to do journalism, for example. The field has changed so dramatically from the time that I started as a student journalist, as an undergraduate at Georgetown in the early 90s, is that, again, we were trained as print journalists, right? And so I always tell my students now, you have to think about how to do everything. You can't just simply write for newspapers or magazines, in part because nobody's reading those anymore. So you got to find a way to lean in to convergence, right? How do you do multimedia stuff? So I'm training my students to think about how to take photos, how to do podcasts, how to do all of this stuff. And so I think part of it is to try to figure out how to take your talents and utilize them in this kind of ever evolving technological world. So I think that's the piece about journalism that's so exciting, is that there's an opportunity for people who traditionally hadn't been trained to enter into the field to now become great journalists. When you think about the young lady who took the video of George Floyd, right? And she was awarded the Pulitzer for that coverage, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. But had she not taken that video, we would not have known really what had happened to George Floyd in the way in which the world came to know it. So I think in many ways we're thinking about we have to think about journalism in a very different way. So there's opportunities, I think.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I know we're going to get into it, both journalism, higher ed journalism, and then of course your new book. But likely along the way, right, from when Jamal was in college and thinking all the way up to now professor and associate dean and higher ed columnist, editor, Jamal, what advice did you get from folks about how to enter into this field that you found most useful?
Yeah, so when I grew up in Philadelphia, and I remember being interested as a young kid in journalism And I remember someone from the Philadelphia Daily News. I met them at one of these events. They come to your school and talk about, what they do for a living. And I remember this writer saying to me that journalism was a form of justified nosiness, right? And I loved it as a kid. I was like, I'm nosy, and I don't need to be ashamed of being nosy, right? That's true.
Yeah.
And that stuck with me. And I then realized, wow, I can make a living from simply talking to people. And then from an early age, I then viewed that as a form of education, right? So that every day I was learning something entirely new, right? I was learning because I was talking to all of these experts and all these people who had all of this amazing experience, and I was learning from them. And so even as a higher ed journalist, it's very interesting because I get a chance almost every day to feel like I'm in graduate school again, so that I'm learning from these experts in a way, and then taking these very complicated ideas and then kind of making them accessible to the larger world. And that's not always easy to do, especially when you're talking about physics and biology and all of the sciences and all of those things. But even some of these complicated philosophical ideas are often hard to translate. And so I think, one of the things I hope we're able to do as scholars and journalists is find ways to make our work more accessible, particularly to the communities and the people that we're writing about. Because oftentimes I think there's that disconnect. So that's the advice that I got, was that it's okay to be nosy, and to poke around, and to do it in a way in which you're able to live out your own curiosity. And so that's what I've tried to do.
I love that. Justified nosiness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What advice would you have for folks who are?
I love that. I've been thinking about mine as Jamal was talking. For me, being in enrollment management and tapping my toe into consulting, I think the best advice I have is really kind of what I heard today with someone else we were talking to, is to invest in yourself. There are some things, in enrollment management, there is really not a class or not a program that you can go into to learn about it. It's really learning on the job, going to conferences, reading, asking others who've been in the field before, tips and strategies that they use, and it has been proven to work. So always being willing to learn, being curious, being nosy, and taking that information and applying it immediately. Also understanding that it's something that it's going to take time and some work. Also understanding that, what I've learned in consulting work is that, boy, the job can be hard. But the thing that I love about it is what you shared, is making these complicated ideas accessible to the world. And one thing that we talk about all the time when we're writing together, we step away from the laptop sometimes and ask ourselves, can grandma read this and understand it? And I think that it takes time, it takes work, it takes skill. But as long as you're investing in yourself, then you can accomplish it.
Yeah, that's great.
I'm thinking, in one previous conversation, Jamal, which I think fits tonight's conversation with you, but would be my advice to those who are looking to get into, we were somewhere and someone was saying like, hey, look, you can't get around saying it. They worked in a diversity center on a campus and in a state that has decided not to have those kinds of centers. So they lost their job, their team lost their job. But like most of us, they got bills and a house and family they're trying to take care of. And they're like, guys, I need some help to get back in. And here's the other part, like in their mind, they say, all I do is diversity. So if all I do is diversity and you can't do diversity, what am I supposed to do? And we help them, we hope, think about the fact that you don't do diversity. You do strategic planning.
That's right.
Right. You built a diversity plan, but it was a strategic plan that framed diversity. You don't just do diversity. You are, quite frankly, a wonderful program manager, because if you did nothing in that center, you built programs, right? So we had to help them. Some people say generalize. We don't think that's generalizing. We were helping them specify those skills and talents that they have, and they're able to do the work. So my piece of advice would be, what did you just say yours was? Yeah. So I want to say, do the work.
Yeah.
Do the work. and understand that the work is not being on the podcast. The work is not going to the conference. The work happens backstage before you are ever front stage. Like, I know that you probably could just take this and run with it, Jamal, but like, I remember we were somewhere and you told me first about your book with Reverend Sharpton.
Mm-hmm.
But then as I read the book, I realized, I said, Jaquan, do you know Jamal? Jamal's like a real writer. Like, he's out here writing for real, not just news, but it's a well-researched book, Jamal. So like, you had to do the work to go to the archives, to go and interview the people, to do I'm not trying to steal your thunder. I mean, you got to tell us how you did all that. But I mean, it's more than just, I sat at a table for 5 minutes and heard Reverend Sharpton and then wrote a book. And I think sometimes people miss that part, that the amount of work that goes into the research for the book.
Yeah.
Before we ever hold it in our hand. And I know the real debt one's going to be the same.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. But before we get into that, you were saying something that really resonated with me, and that is this idea that our identities are tied to our jobs, right? And that's problematic in many ways, because we are more than simply, where we work, right? We have these kind of various forms of our identity. I think that's a really important point, because I think people often, I talk to people all the time and they say, oh, I left my job, I'm not there anymore, but yet they're so focused on their job. And it's like, well, what are you doing now? Oh, I'm still thinking about my job. And because we allow those actual jobs to consume us, rather than the kinds of skills and talents that we've developed, how we could then use those in other forms of our life and our work. So I appreciate it. That really sort of helped me today as you were speaking, because I think that we have to sort of think in that way.
Yeah.
And I think when you think about Reverend Sharpton, since that was your question, I think he has sort of embodied that, right? So when we think about, traditional pastors, right? We often think of pastors who have a church, and the kind of civil rights work that they may do is an extension of that church. Well, Reverend Al Sharpton has never had a church per se, but the kind of ministry, social justice ministry, has been so much grounded in his work that he is still very much in the tradition, as I think about it, of Martin Luther King, Jesse Jackson, and others as well. And I think the social justice piece of his ministry has been to show up when there's been these kinds of incidents around our country, whether it was Trayvon Martin, or whether it was George Floyd, or Amadou Diallo, or Usman Zango, and I can go on and on, which I think is a sad indictment in our country of the kinds of brutality that Black people have faced. But there's been one consistent voice through all of those decades, and that has been Al Sharpton. So I actually met him just as a college student, again in the early 90s when I was at Georgetown. He was at an event with Jesse Jackson, and I sort of went to this event, and I had heard and had followed Al Sharpton as a college student, but was really fascinated when I heard him speak, because the Al Sharpton I met in the early 90s was not the Al Sharpton that you see today. Physically, he just looked different, right? I mean, he was much bigger.
Yeah.
He was much more kind of, loud and brass almost. But what was fascinating to me was how both the kind of elite Blacks and the kind of working class Blacks were responding to him, as he was speaking. And I thought, this is interesting. I mean, this is a guy who, had really put his life on the line, because, many people don't know that in the 90s, while he was leading a protest in New York, he was stabbed and almost assassinated. I mean, it was some racist kind of ran up to him, stuck a knife in his chest, and he was rushed to Coney Island Hospital, where he was laid up in the emergency room for a couple of days. And so again, that takes real courage, right? You think about Dr. King, of course, being not only assassinated, but he was also stabbed as well. You think about all of the kind of threats that our civil rights leaders have to go through. And so to me, it was really strange that nobody had really put the time and the effort of chronicling this amazing life that really began at the age of 4. He preached his first sermon when he was 4 years old, using the text, let not your heart be troubled. And then from there, kind of became ordained at the age of 10, all in the Pentecostal tradition in church. And again, that was kind of strange because here he is preaching to all of his friends' parents, right? They're actually like, it's just a kind of interesting thing. And then he becomes enamored with Adam Clayton Powell, enamored with Jesse Jackson, enamored with Dr. King, and he decides really at a young age that he's going into that tradition. And I think at a time when there were others around him who were saying, maybe you ought to go to divinity school and get a church. Again, that was not the path that he wanted to go. He believed that his mission was really social justice and using religion and theology as a way of helping people to understand that if you are indeed a Christian, if you are indeed professing to be a person of God, then you have to be on the right side of history and fighting these battles. And that's what he's done.
Wow. And that's such ageless wisdom because we need it now. We see we continue to benefit, fortunately, from his life and his leadership, already having left and set a legacy, but also just the world, as you said, there's so much going on, and having individuals who are committed to that kind of justice, we'll call it, that justice work, whether it's from the pulpit, from the classroom, from the streets, whatever it might be. Now's the time. So we're already into it. So let's get ready to do this. As y'all know, we are in the studio with Dr. Jamal Watson. He is an award-winning journalist. He's held numerous roles over his career. He's been a senior staff writer, managing editor, executive editor, editor at large. He's written and edited books and journal articles. He's on the graduate faculty at Trinity Washington University. Let me tell you how good he is at Trinity Washington, y'all. We posted this on X, and Trinity Washington University's president retweeted it. So you're doing pretty well when your university president will share the post. So we thank you for that.
She's a courageous president. I'll tell you, she's wonderful. Yeah,
we cannot wait to hear.
McGuire, I got to give a shout out to President McGuire. In this climate, when so many presidents, and we'll talk about this later, are so scared of everything happening, she's actually been a courageous voice in speaking out against the administration. So I appreciate her.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, it speaks volumes to the fact that, you're there, you're a faculty member, you're an associate dean. You have contributed to and are a contributor to the Washington Monthly. I could go on and on and on. Education Week listed you as one of the nation's top 200 university-based educators who have influenced education policy. He already shared it, y'all, but a native of Philadelphia. He's got a bachelor's degree in English. We're going to talk about it. In theology. Well, I didn't know that. Okay, got to read. From Georgetown University, master's degree from Columbia School, Graduate School of Journalism, master's in higher ed from the University of Delaware, and a PhD, y'all, in African American studies from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. I know this because he is my fraternity brother. He's a member of the greatest fraternity there ever was and is, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. But I can tell you this, me and Jaquin know that he's also just a good dude, someone who you can talk to, someone you can relate to, and an effective communicator. So we're glad to have you on the show. Looking forward to talking a little bit more. So you've already kicked into it a little bit. First of all, Jamal, how did you get into writing?
How did I get into writing? Wow. So, it's one of those things that's hard to pinpoint the exact moment. But I just think from the time I was a kid, I was writing. I was reading and I was writing. I was, some of my the early authors that I was reading was Toni Morrison and Zora Neale Hurston and James Baldwin, and just reading and consuming. And then again, finding a love towards journalism, telling other people's stories, right? and having conversations like we're having tonight, where we can.
Uh-oh, the mute tapped on you.
We think you're still muted.
Says your mic. Oh goodness. Let's see. Give us a moment, those of you. There we go. What about now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can now.
Okay. I'm not sure what happened.
But ask all of our prayer warriors to start praying. The listening audience.
Yeah, what I was saying was that journalism to me was just an interesting field to go into, because you had the ability to be able to tell other people's stories, and I thought that was really quite fascinating. And so again, I think in middle school I started the school newspaper. In middle school, in high school, was editor of my high school newspaper, and then in college became the editor of my college newspaper. And so I always thought that writing was the ability to just be able to tell people stories in a way that was transformative and powerful, and I've been doing it ever since. I couldn't imagine not writing.
Yeah.
You know, even when I transitioned into editing, again, it was always to try to help writers become better, right? And so, and even teaching students, again, I enjoy being able to coach students on writing, and help them to understand how to connect their ideas and thoughts that they have up here onto paper, and to be able to share that with the world. And so it's been quite fun to do.
You know, I have a lot of questions, and I have to say that I have probably fanboyed from afar. So I'm glad you joined us. I'm curious though. I have two questions. I'm gonna go with the first one. Is, you know, what strategies would you give others to become better writers?
I think, again, like exercising, you have to do it, right? You have to find ways to practice that muscle every day. And so I write every day. Sometimes they're longer pieces, sometimes they're shorter pieces, sometimes they're not getting published. But writing, I think you just have to do it. And then I think you have to be willing to share your writing with others, right? And that's always tough to do, because the critiques that come along with that, which is, you might get back some responses that you're not quite happy with, but I think that makes you a better writer. And I also think that you have to just read others, right? And so I enjoy reading. The thing about higher ed reporting is that what is amazing to me is how many higher ed journalists don't actually read the scholars that they're writing about, which is weird to me. Like, so they actually are interviewing all these people and they never read their work. And so again, when I got a chance to interview for the first time Dr. Strayhorn, or Jerlando Jackson, or James Moore, or Fred Bonner, or all these people, I'd already read their work. So I knew, and I think they appreciated the fact that I actually came to the discussion having done my homework. And I think so many writers often are unprepared. And there's a laziness, quite frankly, in our field, where we're just expecting people to just give us everything as writers, as journalists, and we not have to do the work. No, that means you actually need to read that peer-reviewed article. And I think it's helpful to have that background as well. So I would say, do the research, do the work. Writing is one piece of it, but the other part of it is actually digging into the archives, digging into the scholarly work, really being prepared as possible.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to pick up where we left off, and your book on Reverend Al Sharpton really digs into both the myth, the man, the legend. So what does Sharpton's story reveal about the evolution of Black politics in America, and what lessons resonate today?
Yeah, I think it reveals that it's ever evolving, right? And so oftentimes we think when we think about the historiography of Black people and Black politics or Black civil rights, we often start off with Dr. King, and then we go to Jesse Jackson, kind of maybe, and then we lead to Obama, as if that was all that happened, you know. And so it's very strange. I mean, when you think about, um, and I know Brother Strayhorn, your work in Richmond, if you think about the civil rights activists that emerged from Atlanta to Richmond, like Y.A.T. Walker, who was in the Richmond area before his death, and there are countless foot soldiers who were a part of this movement other than just Dr. King, Jesse Jackson, and then jumping by politics to Obama. Even from a political standpoint, I mean, you have Black mayors elected in the 1960s. I'm from Philadelphia. We had a Black mayor, Wilson Good, in 1980s. I mean, you had David Dinkins in New York City. And so there's been this tradition of both civil rights and Black politics as well, but often we don't know like that, right? And so I think one of the things we have to do is help to kind of fill in the missing pieces of the local, right? It's not always national kind of movements, but the local activism, the local political organizing that's taking place in Indianapolis, that's taking place in, Oakland and Dallas and Houston, all of these places across the country that is often missing from the narrative and often not talked about. So I think that's part of that. So when I think about Al Sharpton, I think of him as part of the continuation and legacy of that tradition. But I also think of someone who is very much in Dr. King's nonviolent tradition. I think part of, the misperception of Al Sharpton is that he was a Black nationalist. He never was a Black nationalist. He never was in the tradition of Malcolm. He was very much in the tradition of Martin Luther King. Even at a time when, as a Black New Yorker, he's there in Brooklyn, Malcolm is very much active in the 1960s in Harlem. And in New York, Reverend Sharpton was very much committed to King's nonviolent idea. And so I think part of, we have to correct as scholars, right, and as writers, we have to correct the record, which is to say that Sharpton very much comes out of that nonviolent tradition and has really much kept steady in that very tradition of Dr. King, grounded in the Black church.
So before I kick it over to Jaquin, this little virtual background keep breaking through, but talk to us a little bit about the methodology for that book. How did you start to put it together and weave this? I mean, what was your methodology?
Yeah, so and it's still ongoing because the book, you've seen earlier excerpts, but it's actually not out yet. It's still kind of making its way finalized at all. But the methodology was that it took like 15 to 20 years to write this book, in part because you're tracking this kind of international figure. Like, so I remember going with Reverend Sharpton to Ireland. And I was surprised because I thought of him in many ways as a very domestic kind of person. Like, of course, he'd be recognized in the streets of New York or in Atlanta, but there he was in walking the streets of Dublin and people coming up to him and like, Reverend Al Sharpton, it's great to meet you and thank you for your civil rights and what you did, for Amadou Diallo was amazing. And what I realized was that civil rights was in fact human rights. And it was in this broader context that people appreciated his activism, right? And so the methodology was that I spent a lot of time talking with him. I interviewed 250 people for the book, everyone from Bill Clinton to Louis Farrakhan, to Jesse Jackson, to Valerie Jarrett, who was, of course, aide to Barack Obama. And because I wanted to find out how Sharpton was able to not only be this kind of civil rights figure, but how he was able to kind of deal with the Obama administration. I remember, and I'll tell a quick story because this is really important. I remember being at Ebenezer Baptist Church on the eve of Barack Obama's election, right? So it's 2008, November, whatever, 3rd, and we're at Dr. King's church, right, where he was the pastor. And in the audience is John Lewis, you know, it was Andy Young, you know, one of Dr. King's lieutenants. There was Christine Ferris, who was Dr. King's sister. It was, of course, Bernice King and Martin Luther King III, his children. And Al Sharpton was the keynote speaker. And I thought this is really interesting because Al Sharpton wasn't a contemporary of Dr. King. Most people think Al Sharpton is older than he is. He's actually only 70 years old. He's not, he was born in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education that year. And so he's not one of King's contemporaries. He had only met Dr. King maybe one time because he was just a young kid. But there he was at Ebenezer Baptist Church in the pulpit, delivering the keynote speech, basically ushering in the first Black president. And you saw the civil rights establishment ceding the pulpit to Al Sharpton, who at one time they kind of kept the distance from him because he was like controversial, and you know, they thought of him as maybe a rabble rouser. But there he was, and so it helped me to understand the evolution that often takes place. Here's a guy who had evolved over time, and he would often tell me the stories about how Coretta Scott King, Dr. King's widow, would say to him, "You know, Al, you're doing good work, but you got to be careful that your tongue is not getting in the way of your larger purpose." So that means that sometimes name calling isn't really that effective. Sometimes you got to be a little temperate in your response because that could, in fact, destroy all of the good work that you're trying to accomplish. And as a result of following him, I started seeing the evolution. So there he was, and then it was announced, right? Wolf Blitzer came on the screen from CNN saying Barack Obama has been elected, and the Black church erupted. And basically, that was Al Sharpton's moment because he had to figure out in that moment how he was going to do civil rights as a Black leader with the first Black president ever to lead. Martin Luther King never had to deal with that because Martin Luther King had Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson, and John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. But now Sharpton had to figure out, how do I do civil rights in this totally new era in which now we have the first Black president? And the reason why talking to Valerie Jarrett and others were really helpful because they came to trust Al Sharpton as somebody who, even when they disagreed, that President Obama actually really trusted. And so he gained the confidence of the Obama administration. And as a result, I think was able to help, bridge Obama's credibility, quite frankly, with the streets. Because, you know, there were some Black people who were concerned that perhaps Obama was not, doing everything he could. And so having a civil rights leader like Al Sharpton say, hey, let's cool it. We got to give this man, he can't fix everything. He can't be just the president for Black Americans. He's the president for all Americans. I think it gave Obama some cover. And I think as a result, I think in many ways, Obama helped to sanitize Reverend Sharpton from some of the earlier scandals and things that he had been a part of. So I think it was mutually beneficial.
Yeah, that is so eloquent and insightful.
Yeah, I took the words right out of my mouth. Dang. Well, I appreciate you sharing that because it was insightful. And I want to switch over to student debt, and I think I see it in the background where you are. So you've written extensively about student debt. From your perspective, what's missing in the national conversation, and what solutions are being overlooked when it comes to HBCUs and minority-serving institutions?
Yeah, so I think one of the basic thesis of the book and premise is that we ought to start treating the the student debt crisis as if it's a civil rights issue, right? Because the reality is that we tell a whole bunch of people, young people, that they should go to college, they should do all the right things, right? They should get a good education in high school, and they should go to college, and they should get a degree, and yet they're coming out of college worried about whether or not they can buy a home, whether they can buy a car, whether or not they can live this kind of American life. And so I argue that, this debt crisis is in fact a civil rights issue. It's no coincidence that Dr. King, when he was killed, what was he doing? He was in Memphis, where you all are, and he was organizing on behalf of the garbage workers, right? And the next part of his campaign was to deal with economic issues, right? So we're now at this place where I think, when we talk about, like, we all love colleges and universities, but we talk about the simple cost of attending a college and a university in this country is just, it's just astronomical. And that you have all these young people who are beginning to question whether or not they can even go to college, right? Because of that. So the first thing is I wanted to frame this as a civil rights issue, in part because when we think about those who are impacted, we know from the data that Black women, right, carry the most in terms of debt, right? So if there's 1.7 trillion people, $1.7 trillion of Americans that are facing debt, Black women carry a large, significant portion of that. Why is that important? Because when we think about Black women, often they're the caregivers, right? They're the mothers, they're the ones taking care of the community. They're bearing a lot of the burdens of our society, and yet they can't catch relief. And so, one of the things I wanted to do was frame this to say, how can we reimagine? And there are possibilities, and you all know there are models all around the world of, countries that are getting it right. So how can we reimagine how we think about who gets access to college and who can, of course, get through? I spent a lot of time on college campuses, and of course, one of the things that the presidents always tell me is that, the reason why John can't get from, first year to second year, or even third year to fourth year, is not because of a lack of skills or talents. It's often because there's a lack of money. And then even beyond that, the question becomes, how can we get them home, right? So when COVID happened, you had HBCUs in particular scrambling to, create all kinds of emergency funds to get students back home because they didn't have the money or the means to be able to just hop on a plane or even a bus and to be able to get home. And then Wi-Fi and broadband. I remember talking to the president of Thurgood Marshall College Fund, Harry Williams, and he was telling me that a lot of the students who attended HBCUs, particularly in rural areas, they didn't have broadband, right, to be able to connect at home, to be able to do their courses online. So some schools actually had to send like correspondence, like material, like you do correspondence courses through the mail, and students had to complete and send them back. I mean, it's hard to imagine that we were doing that, in 2020 and 2021, but yet that was happening. And so I think what we need to do, first of all, is we need to double the Pell Grant, right? So right now, Pell is at $7,395. The United Negro College Fund, Thurgood Marshall College Fund, many progressive leaders are arguing that Pell needs to at least be doubled. You cannot, $7,395 as the top max that a student receives is just not enough. And then I think we need to find ways to both bridge the private sector and government so that we can have some meaningful reform. Now, some of us were very hopeful this time last year, before the election, that we were going to actually really start to see some real reform. But of course, elections have consequences, right, in many ways. And I think what we saw was that all of the work that had been done by civil rights activists and other organizers to try to push Biden, because remember, President Biden did not come to the discussion of student debt relief easily. I mean, he was very hesitant in the beginning, and eventually he came along. But of course, now that's all gone. And so now you have individuals back to square one trying to figure out how they're going to not default on their loan, damaging their credit, damaging their opportunities.
Yeah. I love the framing of the issue as a civil rights issue, right? So that it gets us beyond just thinking about this as the problem or the consequence of those who choose to go to higher ed, but it also calls our attention to the short and long-term impacts of this oppressive debt, right? That because of it, you just nailed it in your last couple seconds. It affects your credit. It affects your ability to buy a home, to get a car. You know, for some people who are in our listening audience, they may not see the connection that it can affect your opportunities of getting a job, because there are some jobs that in their background checks, they run credit checks. I mean, and so having mounting levels of debt and the amounts that we're talking about can just devastate one's sort of outlook. And to your point, we appreciate researchers like yourself who pay attention to the disproportionate impact that issues like debt have on society, that disaggregate the data to be able to talk very plainly about the fact that it impacts women and women of color in ways that it doesn't other people. So we've got to be, so whatever that solution we come up with, it should be just as focused on where we know the real problems are.
That's right. Yeah. And I think, again, the question I often get is, well, how can you make this a bipartisan kind of discussion, right? How can you get Republicans and Democrats on board? And I said, okay, even beyond the civil rights discussion, which I think is significant and important, is this idea of global competitiveness, right? And so if people if we need nurses to go into rural areas, or we need teachers to go into urban areas to teach, and if they can't do that because they're not going to pursue a degree because they're concerned that they're actually going to owe more money than they will ever make in all their years of teaching, then I don't know. I mean, it's great we have all of these programs, but I don't know how we're going to solve that unless we solve this debt crisis issue. And again, I know that certain states and certain places have, these provisional programs, which is if you do X amount of years of public service, some of your loans will be forgiven. But I think that ought to not be the exception. It should be the norm across the board. And I think, again, you're talking about people graduating on average $38,000, $40,000. That's a lot of money. And the question becomes, we need to figure this out, and I think we can. In the book, I talk about what Robert Smith, the philanthropist and businessman, of course, did at Morehouse, which is not a surprise, where he forgave the debt of the students who had graduated. I think it was I can't remember. It was in 2019, I think, or 18. But I'd like to see more of that kind of private philanthropy being done. There's a partnership between Starbucks and Arizona State University, where, again, a lot of the students, they get kind of their their debt cleared over a period of time. So there are these innovative programs out there. I wish they would become much more mainstream.
Yeah, we do too. And so for anyone who's out there listening in the live audience or who will watch later, please, if you know about these kinds of partnerships, then please be in touch. We'll give you a way to reach Dr. Watson and just at the end of the show. And then certainly you can reach out to us at Do Good Work. So I want to flip the script just a little bit and listen. So as someone who has chronicled higher education for years, what's, in your opinion, the art and science of writing news about colleges and universities that really gets to the issues that matter? I mean, I just read your recent piece about Ibram X. Kendi's return to Howard. And Ibram, if you're out there, we want to get you on the podcast too, right? We may as well just put it out
Absolutely.
there. But there's so many ways that you could capture that story, right? And there's so many, quite frankly and directly, there are other stories out there about it that don't focus on the arc of return and what it means for him and for the institution that you carefully selected and crafted. And there are other aspects of his career and journey that some people, in my opinion, complicate the story by focusing on things that don't even have anything to do with Howard.
Mhm.
You obviously chose not to do that. And we see that a lot. I mean, we all see that a lot in higher ed writing. So in your experience in your writing, what's that art and science or writing news about college and university really good at those issues?
So I don't know what the art and science is. I'll tell you what my philosophy is, which I think is different from how other journalists approach it. I think, first of all, we are too reactionary, right, in how we're writing about institutions and about people. And I think oftentimes the reporting is, again, a kind of gotcha journalistic endeavor that takes place, which I find deeply problematic as well. Um, and so I'm concerned about our field, quite frankly. When I was in at Columbia, they had different tracks. So you could be a student studying journalism at Columbia, and you could be interested in religion reporting, right? Or you could be interested in K-12 reporting, or you could be interested in, a whole host of the environment. And what I realized is that we don't have tracks in higher education to help train people and students on how to be higher ed reporters, right? And I think that's important because I think if you're a higher ed reporter, you need to know like some basic stuff about higher ed, And so we just say, oh, just go cover that institution. And so, I've seen it where reporters are showing up and they don't understand like about the process of a dissertation of defense, or they don't understand about assessment, or they don't understand about, or have never heard of middle states or any of this stuff, which I think is so important. And quite frankly, that would not be tolerated in any other field. Like if you're covering the White House or you're covering politics, you're expected to know this stuff. And in higher ed, we often say, whosoever will, let them come, because
Yeah.
you'll find out and learn along the way. And I think it's frustrating for a lot of academics talking to these reporters because they're like, well, dang, don't you know something? Like, don't you understand how governance work? Or don't you understand the role of the provost or the role of the dean? Or, they don't understand any of this stuff. And so I think in many ways, we have to do a better job in training people to really understand higher ed. And that institutions are not all the same. So again, if you're using Harvard or the Ivies as the model, well, that's problematic because most students don't go to Harvard or to the Ivies, right? And in fact, I think community colleges in general are probably underreported the most, even though the majority of our students, right, go to community colleges through year. But you see very, very little coverage about community colleges. And even, the HBCUs, oftentimes it's this kind of very strange framing. So you start off with, well, it's Howard, Spelman, Morehouse, and then these other institutions down here. And it's always from this kind of deficit, point of view. And so my philosophy is that we need to be more reactionary in telling stories that I think are affirming, that show best practices. And people, some of my colleagues and some other publications probably say, "Oh, that's just you're just giving people a pass and you're just writing about all the feel good stuff." But I think what we found in my time at Diverse is that people actually appreciate those feel good stories, those best practice stories, because they're able to say, that institution is doing something really remarkable. How can we figure out how to take some of that juice and some of that energy and apply it to our institution? And what I found really amazing is when I've had predominantly white institutions say, "You've written about an HBCU. So I never knew that they had this program. And now we're kind of doing this and we're taking it away." But yet, why is it that many of these institutions don't get credit for that, right? It's always like, oh, the HBCUs are replicating what the PWIs are doing. That's not necessarily true. So I think we've got to figure out a way to really tell those positive stories. Now, there are ways to do that. And part of it is that we have to help and train the institutions themselves on how best practices work within journalism. So, for example, I got a call, I remember like a couple of months ago, from someone at an HBCU who's mad at me because I didn't call them for a quote, right? And I had to remind them that I called them for a quote like a couple of months earlier and that they never responded. Or when they did respond, it was like 2 days later after my deadline. So part of what we need to do, and I understand that PR staffs at particularly minority service institutions, sometimes it's one person, maybe a small, but we have to help to educate people on how to respond timely, how to do it in a way where they can get a soundbite or a quote in that's accurate. And then we need to help institutions build out their source lists, right? So I think every institution ought to have the list of their scholars who are eager and available to be on media, listed on their website, so that if I'm writing a story about the Black church, I can go and find out, oh, there's so-and-so there who's an expert on the Black church and they're willing to talk to me. Because the thing that I get frustrated the most about is when I watch a CNN or MSNBC or ABC or any of these television shows, and I'm hearing someone talk about being an expert on HBCUs or an expert on something, and it's clear to me they don't know what they're talking about. It's just absolutely clear that they don't know what they're talking about. And I'm saying to them, why in the world do you not have somebody who is actually trained in this field? And it suddenly dawned on me that number one, the producers don't know those people, right? So we need to make the connection so that they actually know who these folks are. Sometimes it's lazy, but sometimes it's just not being familiar. But the other is that there are a lot of people who are media savvy who have found a way to get on TV and get quoted because they're fast, right? Yeah. You email them, they email you 30 seconds, back, and they're ready to give you a quote. So we need to train, and I'm not suggesting that people have to be on their phones and on their email all the time, because we need to have lives where we can step away from some of that. But we also need to be prepared to be in positions ready to step in to offer that analysis, which I think will help our nation and our world as well. So that's my take. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that we've got to do a better job in higher ed reporting, because we're not doing a very good job at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really like that you said, you talk about some of the things that are good practices that other schools are doing and writing about it. So, other higher ed leaders and professionals can read that work and see ways they can apply it to their institution. And as you said earlier, there are many reporters out there who approach the work as gotcha, and we so many things about, just the gloom and doom. So it is okay to write about those things. And I encourage more to write about some of the best practices that are happening across the country. So we're close to time, and I think we can get maybe two more in. So for young scholars and journalists who want to write boldly about politics and education, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, so I would say don't be scared. I mean, we're living in an environment now where everybody's afraid. I mentioned my president, Patricia McGuire, who, again, I have to salute because she's one of the courageous presidents who's willing to take on, again, any administration that's talking about getting rid of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. Any administration that's talking about cutting the funding from minority serving institutions. I mean, it's outrageous. And again, I understand in some ways why some institutions don't want to be the target of the Trump administration. But I think for journalists, right, our job is to tell the truth and to be courageous, right? So we started off this conversation with talking about Reverend Al, and one of Reverend Al Sharpton's favorite quotes is, "If you're scared, say you're scared and go sit down somewhere and let those who are not scared get up and lead." Because oftentimes, right, we're scared, but we get in the way of preventing other people from taking the leadership because, when we block folks. And so I don't think everybody has to be necessarily vocal, but they don't criticize, somebody else who's actually willing to take on the mantle and run with it. So I think journalists have to be particularly courageous during this moment that we're in. I'm very concerned that, again, what I'm seeing at institutions around the country, they're folding their programs. They're doing quite a bit. And I'm worried that when you talk about law firms, they're being scared away. I'm also worried about media. Folks are changing their names. They're talking about, not doing the kinds of reporting that was, instrumental to writing, particularly about minoritized communities. So I think we need to have young people who are fearless, who's willing to question, particularly during the time of this administration, and write stories without, fear. So that's my advice.
Yeah. Well, having written so much, and of course, teaching, learning, I mean, we couldn't name all the things you do. Do you have a favorite piece of yours or favorite project of yours that, sort of stands out? Like, this is the one that if someone says, send me your best work, which one are you sending? What are you most proud of?
I mean, there's so many. The joy of being able to spend a day or two on a college or university. I was just with Zachary Faison, the good brother down at Edward Waters University. You also have him on your show,
Yeah.
because he's doing some amazing work at Edward Waters University. You turned that institution around, and you hear these stories, but you got to go see it. And so I spent 2 days on the ground, and then I was with Chancellor James Minor at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. That brother's doing some good work. So it's just too much. But for me, the fun part of this job has been to kind of parachute in and to just spend time listening. And I know the two of you do a lot of that through your public speaking, where the joy of the work that you get to do isn't even showing up in educating, but being educated by the people who are there, right? So, that to me is the real joy of this work. So I don't know if I have one. I can't think of one in particular that comes to mind, but all of the experiences are just wonderful where I can meet people and really write about their experience. The one thing I will say quickly is that you asked what is missing, and I think often what's missing in higher ed reporting is centering students. Right.
Mhm.
So we often write about the experiences of administrators. We often write about the experience of faculty, and that's important. But sometimes we don't even put the voices of students. So one of the things I used to tell my reporters when I was the editor, I used to say, listen, I want you reading college newspapers, right? Because college newspapers give you a good sense of what's happening on campus, right? And you need to be familiar with who the student journalists are. Because we used to have our internship program, and there was a pipeline to actually get those best journalists that are doing higher ed reporting. Because if you're on a college newspaper, you're doing higher ed reporting. You're writing about your institution. And they would often be the source for some of our great stories that we write about. But yet, some of these young people, as talented as they are, it gets back to what we started off with, not being able to find a job. They get out of college, and no one's told them that, again, having a high GPA is great, right? But in journalism, you need clips, right? You need a portfolio. And so, again, they don't understand that they actually need to get an internship. And so I think, one of the things I would like for our publications to do is to form better relationships with institutions to help create these pathways to higher ed reporting. And we can do it. Like, you got Inside Higher Ed, you got Chronicle, you got Diverse Issues, you got Insight into Academia. Why couldn't they all pull their resources together and say, we love higher ed reporting. We want to invest in creating an internship or some scholarship that invests in the next generation of higher education reporters.
Wow.
I think that is something that could easily be done.
Yeah, that would be.
And you're doing that at HBCU too, by the way.
Listen, I cannot not say that I got to bring this up next week at some meeting on my own campus. So because it's such we always talk about creating pathways. We used to say pathways to careers, but our president, 13th president of Virginia Union University, Dr. Hakeem J. Lucas, often has us think.
Visionary, he is. Yes, he is.
What'd you say?
a real visionary he is. Yes.
Yeah. And now he talks and pushes us as an institution to really think about how are we creating pathways to generational wealth. And, higher ed, the degree, the certificate, the badge, as you just said, the on-ramp into journalism is just one of the ways that we create that pathway to generational wealth. It doesn't stop at graduation. It doesn't stop at getting the job. It's about how do we make sure that their families, their mom, dad, all, benefit from this investment in higher ed. And so I think it's so solid. So listen, for folks who want to stay connected to Jamal Watson, what's the best place for them to look for you and your work?
Yeah. So I don't do LinkedIn. For those who do LinkedIn, bless you, I don't do it. But I do X. And so it's Jamal Eric Watson. And Facebook, you can find me and look forward to getting connected.
Well, we really have enjoyed our time with you. And to each and every one of you out there, listen, you know how to find us every single week on Saturdays on this channel. We are so grateful for you tuning in to another episode of Do Good Work Podcast. Listen, you got a good weekend ahead of you, and then you turn around and rinse and repeat next week. So don't be afraid to go out there and do something. But if you're going to do something good. Y'all know what we call it. We call it doing good work. We're out.
Thank you for tuning in to Do Good Work Podcast. We hope you found today's conversation informative, uplifting, and insightful. Don't forget to like and share this episode with your networks. Follow us on social media at Do Good Work on X, formerly Twitter, for real-time updates, behind-the-scenes content, and so much more. Until next time, friends, don't be afraid to do something, but do something good. Do good work.